Brought to you by Charity Mobile, the phone company that supports life and family. 5% of your monthly plan price goes to your favorite charity. Buy the way you believe at CharityMobile.com and use promo code TRADITION. The Vatican has quietly been waging a almost silent battle against religious orders since at least 2013, although there are credible reports that this was going on before Francis under Benedict, if not earlier even than that. Now, I've covered countless different congregations of mostly women religious who are dedicated to the traditional Mass, or traditional form of the sacraments, and the traditional charisms of their orders, all of them getting targeted by Rome for suppression, or by local bishops with close ties to Rome, and nearly always the value of the properties those convents sit on are playing a key role in all of this. All of this has picked up a lot of steam in the last few years after the issuing of a document that most people ignored called Cor Orans, which fundamentally altered the life of religious, both men and women, in the life of the church. It enabled the suppression of these organizations, or at the very least forced them to align with the spirit of modernity in Rome today. And a couple of weeks ago, I reported the sort of latest version of this. A traditional nun had been canceled in Rome. Now, this happened in France, and clearly any honest reading of her case showed that what happened to her was an injustice. Weirdly, the secular courts in France decided to intervene. They fined the cardinal most personally responsible and awarded damages to the nun. No, she has not been reinstated to her order. The cardinal in that case is Marc Ouellet. Now, we have an update, and this story gets, predictably, a little more strange. Headline from the National Catholic Reporter: Vatican warns of potential religious freedom violation in court case. Religious freedom, that's an interesting concept, because anybody who reads the Vatican II documents and is familiar with what the church had to say on such issues before the council knows that the church's sudden adoption of secular norms of religious freedom, even if we try to take a little bit more of a Catholic twist to it, those are still novelties. There's no real rooting of them in the history of the church. And so the Vatican is now making a religious freedom case. And one can argue that in cases like this involving the secular courts sticking their nose into the internal business of the church, you can make the case that that's probably the best way to argue it in a society dedicated to such things like modern day France is. But it's still strange to see. Here's what the article has to say on this, because this is weird. Quote, the Vatican Secretariat of State sent a formal statement to the French embassy to the Holy See, reaffirming that Pope Francis had sent a top Vatican official to investigate a French religious congregation, and warning that interference by a French civil court in an internal church matter could be a, quote, serious violation of religious freedom. Matteo Bruni, director of the Vatican Press Office, confirmed April 13th that the Vatican had sent an explanatory, quote, note verbale to the embassy highlighting several points in connection to a French civil court decision made public April 3rd. The ruling by the one-judge Tribunal of Lorient in France ordered 79-year-old Canadian Cardinal Marc Ouellet, a retired prefect of the Dicastery for Bishops, and the two religious who assisted him in the investigation to pay a former nun more than $194,000 for material damages, more than $10,000 for, quote, moral prejudice, and more than $10,000 in legal costs for, quote, abuse of rights, and, quote, lack of impartiality in their decision to dismiss her from the religious community. That community, the Congregation of the Dominican Sisters of the Holy Spirit, was also ordered to pay the former nun $36,000 as a, quote, duty of relief. The defendants were appealing, according to La Croix, the French Catholic daily newspaper. End quote. Again, so you've got fines being leveled against church officials to benefit another person in the church on a purely internal church matter involving the secular authorities, and being argued against that this is essentially a violation of the religious freedom of the Catholic Church and of Catholics. That's what they're arguing. And I have the full press release here for you. We'll go over to that in a second. So from LifeSite, we get the headline, Vatican protests after French court fined Cardinal Ouellet for expelling nun from traditional convent. The Vatican criticized a ruling by a court in Lorient condemning Cardinal Marc Ouellet, his apostolic visitors, and the Dominican community for their, quote, disgraceful and vexatious dismissal of Sister Mary Ferriol. Now, it's worth noting here that apostolic visitations are the preferred mechanism the Vatican uses for going after good bishops and for religious orders, and for even the priestly fraternities. An apostolic visitation being announced is these days sort of a sign, like if you've been having trouble at work, all of a sudden you're being called to have a personal meeting with human resources and the boss. It's that kind of a thing. Bishop Strickland received that apostolic visitation involving two very questionable American bishops who had a really nasty personal history of McCarrick and James Martin kinds of problems. And they were the ones to conduct the apostolic visitation for Rome for his violations of Catholic orthodoxy, basically. And by Catholic orthodoxy, we mean modernist orthodoxy. Now, here in this story, LifeSite writer Michael Haynes provides an English translation of the rather terse press release by the Vatican. So here that is in full. Responding to questions from a number of journalists, the director of the Holy See press office, Matteo Bruni, confirmed that the Secretariat of State has sent a verbal note to the Embassy of France to the Holy See highlighting the following. The Holy See learned only from the press about the alleged decision of the Court of Lorient, France, regarding a civil dispute concerning the resignation from a religious institute of Miss Sabine de la Vallée, formerly Sister Marie Ferriol. His Eminence, Cardinal Marc Ouellet, never received any writ of summons from the Court of Lorient. Cardinal Marc Ouellet actually conducted an apostolic visitation to the Institute of the Dominican Sisters of the Holy Spirit, in compliance with a papal mandate. At the conclusion of this visitation, a series of canonical measures were taken against Miss Sabine de la Vallée, including her dismissal from the religious institute. Any ruling by the Tribunal of Lorient could raise not only relevant issues involving immunity, but if it had ruled on internal discipline and membership in a religious institute, it could have resulted in a serious violation of the fundamental rights to religious freedom and freedom of association of the Catholic faithful. End quote. First complaint here is procedural. Cardinal Ouellet claims he was never notified of the judicial proceeding, which, if true, is a legitimate complaint. After all, if there is a court process and you are named in that process, and you stand to lose quite a lot if the process doesn't go your way, basic norms of justice and, frankly, common sense dictate that you should be called to represent yourself. You should be notified of the process and where you can go and given all the relevant information needed to make a defense of your case. That is a legitimate complaint if it's true. The second complaint is that this violates essentially church-state separations, a uniquely post-Vatican II complaint for the church to make. France has a weird relationship with the church compared to most places, so the courts may just laugh at that complaint. We are talking about the same country that in the first decade of the 20th century passed legislation seizing all church property from before a certain date, including the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris and any older place you can think of in France, and those are now state property administered by the church. Hence why there's been a lot of weird talk about what the renovations to Notre Dame are going to look like when they're done. To say there's a sort of neat separation between the government of France and the Catholic Church in that country is a bit of a misnomer. It's not an accurate argument. And so this complaint here may get laughed at by the Vatican or by the French courts. But here's some context from that LifeSite article. Quote, as LifeSite News has reported, Ouellet's expulsion of Ferriol came over a period of months between October 2020 and April 2021. The sister was eventually told that by the Vatican that she was not suited for the religious life, formally relieved of her vow of virginity in order to remove her traditional Dominican habit. Her lawyer stated she, quote, has never known the facts of which she was allegedly guilty, despite repeated requests from her and her lawyer. Communication was refused on the grounds of confidentiality. Ferriol condemned the, quote, unlawful, harsh, and vexatious conditions regarding her expulsion from the community. She appeared as the chief recipient of punitive measures from the Vatican amidst tensions that had been ongoing in the traditional community for many years. The Ecclesia Dei Commission had conducted an investigation into the community in 2013 over an internal conflict amongst the relatively young order about its founder, Father Victor Alain Berthaud, and his proposed cause for canonization. With the Ecclesia Dei Commission issuing its ruling in 2016, exonerating Berthaud from allegations of improper behavior, a new superior was installed with an aim to unify the community. Tensions nevertheless continued, and Ouellette's apostolic visit came as the culminating event in the internal tensions, as the cardinal sought to align the traditional community with Francis's more modern style of practice. Pope Francis has previously sought to distance himself from and condemn Ecclesia Dei's decision, in a move that sought to cast the Commission's thorough investigation into doubt. The convent has, since Ouellette's arrival in 2020, become a center for efforts to transform the Dominican community away from its traditional focus and celebration of traditional Mass into a community led by the Vatican's focus on the Novus Ordo. Indeed, reports have stated that the more traditional members of the community are being restricted in their actions and in their contact with others, as the apostolic visitation works to implement a more modern practice of spirituality and liturgy. End quote. I want to point out an obvious thing here. The sister was never told what she did wrong. And the Vatican's complaint about this legal process is that Cardinal Mark Ouellette was never notified of the process. The Vatican complaining about that in light of this is hypocrisy. It's rank hypocrisy. And I suspect that the courts are just going to, knowing the facts of this case, that they're just going to laugh at these complaints in general by the Vatican. But you want to notice a common thread here with all the stories I've ever covered like this. It's always religious who are true to traditional in some way that get punished like this. Either they love the pre-Vatican II Mass and are dedicated to it solely, or they are loyal to the charisms of their order and its founder as they existed before the Vatican II changes that were done to religious orders. Read up on the changes to religious life in the church in the late 1960s into basically 1980. It's terrible what was done to them. Either way, this is Francis's personal battle against what he calls rigidity, but instead can rightfully be called dedication to authentic Catholic spirituality. That is what we're seeing here. I'm curious what you think about this. Do you think this nun is going to, her case, she's going to win in court, if that even matters that much? I mean, yes, the financial compensation will greatly help her if she has to essentially live out her vows, living a private life somewhere in an apartment building somewhere in France. Or do you think that the Vatican is going to pursue more legal appeals and things, and that there's a chance that they could have all this overturned? I'm very curious what you think about this case in general, because when I reported on this before, a lot of people were uncomfortable by the role of the French government in this. And I totally get that. This is a very weird situation. And it's unfortunate this is what it takes for the nun to get justice, because she was expelled because she was a vocal advocate for the canonization of the founder of her religious order. And Ecclesia Dei cleared him of all nasty accusations of a McCarrick type. They did their investigation, found he had not done those things, but Francis wanted to pursue it anyway. Not the canonization, but the burying of their founder. Meanwhile, the Legionnaires of Christ exist still. And meanwhile, he has men like Ted McCarrick. He had him close to him until the media made it so he couldn't. And he has men like Marco Rupnik around him still. Let me know what you think of all this in the comments, please. And hit like and subscribe if you haven't. It does help. So does sharing this on social media. That helps too. And as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.